So let's start with basics of understanding risk and core risk management concepts. So there are four basic risk management concepts, and these break down as being the avoidance of risk, risk mitigation, transfer of risk, and risk acceptance.
And Dan, this is Brendan. One of the tips that we use a lot of times when talking about risk management is the four T's, and if we were to line them up with the way you've laid them out here, when confronted with the risk, that you can make one of these decisions. You can terminate the activity that is that's putting you in the path of the risk. You can treat it. You can transfer the risk. You know, a lot of folks think of that as insurance and the like, or you can tolerate it. So it's an easy tip to remember. The four T's, how you deal with risk management.
Exactly. So we're going to just go a little further into detail on these four concepts. So on avoidance, the easiest way to manage an identified risk is to avoid it altogether. And this generally takes place when you refuse to engage in the activities that have been known or perceived to carry that risk. Although avoidance is a simple method to manage potential risks, the strategy also results in lost revenue or mission potential. So for example, if you choose not to have a road in a flood zone, then that you also choose not to be able to facilitate vehicle transportation in that same zone. So as a public sector entity, that may not be a politically palatable option. On risk mitigation, this is meant to lessen the negative consequence or impact of a specific or known risk, and it's most often used when the risks are unavoidable, like the example I just gave. So as an alternative to saying, no, we're not going to have a road here, perhaps your alternatives are to put better stormwater drainage or to raise the road. The risk of capital waste can be significantly reduced through this type of strategy, but risk mitigation does not mean that risk is removed. It only means that a portion of that risk has been mitigated. Risk transfer, as Brendan said, typically takes place by paying a premium to an insurance company in exchange for protection against a substantial financial loss. Although there are other mechanisms that could take place, you could end up in some sort of partnership agreement where you have another entity that is absorbing the risk that is not an insurance entity. And lastly, your tolerance for risk is in acceptance, where you've said, well, we're just going to be here. We understand the risks. We're going to do what we need to do. And if the risk happens, so be it. We accept it. So if we think about a basic risk management process would look like a first step of identifying the risk, the second step of analyzing the risk, a third step of prioritizing, evaluating, or ranking the risk, the fourth step of addressing it, and the fifth of monitoring and reviewing it. Brendan?
Terrific. Well, thanks, Dan. Well, this is an ambitious topic with you know, materiality and disclosure and risk together. So I'd like that we're starting with risk. And so some of you may not have heard of enterprise risk management or of the organization called COSO, which stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. But just to read this to you, what is enterprise risk management? It's a big sentence with a lot of important words here. A culture, capabilities, and practices integrated with strategy and execution that organizations rely on to manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value. So all of those words are important, but this is but risk is the flip side of the coin is opportunity. It is an absolute cousin of corporate strategy, and a lot of times there are enterprise risks are the risks that an organization is for some reason or another unable to execute on its strategy, or potentially in pursuing a strategy that's not going to prove successful. So, but it is all framed at creating, preserving, and realizing value, and this does have a heavy bias to when the word of value of financial value. So if we can go to the next the next slide. But when I mentioned COSO, but so who is COSO? It's kind of a who's who of the accounting profession and industry. So there are 5 organizations, and they include the American Accounting Association, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, Financial Executives International, the Institute of Management Accountants, and the Institute of Internal Auditors. And this group is became super well known outside of the circles that a lot of us financial folks travel. When you've likely heard of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, that when in the wake of the Enron and WorldCom failures and all of that, there was the law passed, the Sarbanes-Oxley, that required public registrants in the U.S. and many other countries have similar requirements now, that they would identify, document, and test their internal controls over financial reporting. And COSO had a framework to do just that. Interestingly, it was also meant to be applied to non-financial reporting as well. But in 2004, COSO also published a document on enterprise risk management, the principles of enterprise risk management. And that document has now been updated and is due to be released as a refreshed version of that later this summer. So, and that gets at much more at strategy and beyond reporting, but strategy, compliance, operations, all the different types of risks that, in a kind of a way that organizations can compare disparate risks across the enterprise. To the next slide, Dan.
It's important to note that while these risks, while COSO emanated from a private sector group of stakeholders, the concept of enterprise risk management and the practices that come under it don't apply only to the private sector, they apply to all sectors.
Yeah, great point. And it is, and it is noteworthy. There are other frameworks. It's just COSO is the most widely used. It's think of it like kind of like the GRI framework. While most organizations use GRI for sustainability reporting, those that don't are still kind of GRI inspired. It's similar with for every organization has some kind of enterprise risk management approach, and whether they explicitly call it COSO or it's merely COSO inspired, it's that's the far and away the majority. There are a couple of others that so there is some ISO stuff around enterprise risk, and there's an organization called Trumbull, which is more in New Zealand and Australia. But these next 2 slides that I speak to is the way that we try to think about risk. That this is this balance of art and science, and the art part of it is that the best way to describe it is that kind of gut feeling. Executives that have been in an organization, in a private company or, in government or a nonprofit for a long time, that just say, this is, they understand how the organization works, and they manage, they make decisions based on their kind of their business experience and their gut feeling. This donut, if you haven't seen this before, we're a big fan of. This comes from Kate Rayworth at Oxfam. That is the kind of the picture for her central thesis of donut economics, which is that there are certainly planetary boundaries, right, environmental ceilings, and these come from the the Rockstrom planetary boundaries that have to be respected, and that they're kind of social floors. Right, so that things like social inequality and all of its manifestations. But the reason we put this, we talk about this as part of the art part of risk management, is that sometimes, unlike kind of doing some math and doing science in order to have a discussion about what risks are really important, particularly things like climate change. Sometimes you have to meet. You always have to meet your internal leaders and managers where they are, and so some of them fall more on the art side than on the science side, and so it's there can be a discussion of that the business operates in the context of the world, of the system of the world, and it kind of it doesn't matter how many ovens that you have. If you run out of cheese, you can't make pizza anymore. And so there's without necessarily getting into doing a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations and kind of good kind of different forecasting models. you might be able to kind of win the day with an argument that meets them kind of on their gut feeling with anecdotes. But we use this this kind of picture to describe where the business, if the business is operating in the middle of that donut, in that kind of safe and just space for humanity, and not too close to the borders of the donut, then all is well. But you get too close to either of those borders, there are some real risks to be dealt with. Maybe just into the next slide, Dan. And this is the other side to it. This is the science part, and and I really think of it as math. But this is where there are plenty of risk people that look at enterprise risks this kind of way, and of doing out different scenarios, of making decision trees, running scenarios where in this case on the left with different warming scenarios. Each of those kind of dark line, bolder lines represents it as kind of an actuarial approach to the degree of variability within each of them of overall performance with overall emissions. So today, a lot of organizations will build an enterprise risk management, their risk register or their inventory of risks, and when they go to stack rank them and compare them, because organizations have scarce financial resources, scarce all kinds of resources, but financial resources to determine how they're going to apply one of those 4 T's. Particularly, are they going to insure? Are they going to otherwise transfer some risk, or are they going to tolerate it, or are they going to treat it somehow? Are they going to do something? When you think about treating it and doing some kind of intervention, there has to be a business case, and that business case has to be compared against the business case for another risk totally unrelated to, in this case, unrelated to climate change. So how an organization decides to treat the risk of occupational safety, or some strategic risk of not being FDA approved for a product, or you can think of there's loads of them. There needs some risk managers kind of require the math to be performed, and to model out and say this is what it would this is what our exposure is, or the flip side, this is what the opportunity is. So again, we titled this as it's a balance of both art and science, but ultimately the takeaway here is to meet your risk leaders where they are.